Let's keep reading Kenny and the Dragon. We are up to chapter 12. One Fierce Beast. The piano continued on, now in time with the weeping cries of Charlotte. Townsfolk began to get up and withdraw from the centre arena. Some left the scene altogether. "This is much more than I bargained for," Kenny heard one farmer cry out. "Maybe this wasn't such a good idea," he heard another say. "Oh, I don't need to see this," stammered a third. As the handful of spectators headed up the aisles toward the exit, an enormous fireball erupted from the cave, instantly incinerating the tattered covers and billowing a cloud of hazy smoke out into the amphitheatre. The thick, murky smog blackened the attendees, who could now barely see one another, let alone anything else. The fleeing audience members froze with fright, not sure whether to run blindly off into the smoke or stay with the masses. "Owen, leave your brother alone." Then a cold, deep reptilian voice thundered over the gathering. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere. "Well, well, well, what a reception this is!" Nobody made a peep, as all were trying to see any sign of the beast in the dense fog. A flapping noise began, and a warm, gusty wind blew the smoke away, revealing the large dragon behind the audience, next to the king's box seats, blocking any escape from the hilltop. Waving his enormous leathery wings, he smiled a jagged, toothy smile. "It looks like the whole town is here. Now this is what I call a smorgasbord," he roared. Graham inhaled deeply and blew a stream of fire straight up into the sky, causing glowing ash to rain down on the amphitheatre. Like fiery snow, he then leaped up on top of the king's tower and peered inside. "Ah, let's start with a royal appetizer," he cackled. "Please stop, Owen." "Back off! Go away! Shoo!" the king yelled as he grabbed his two sons and hid behind the jester. "Dragon!" George's voice cut across the audience and snapped the beast's gaze from the king. "Your fight lies with me, ruffian." "Indeed it does," Graham replied and sprang from the tower, causing it to topple into pieces. He hovered over the crowd for a bit, his expansive beating wings sending trash, ash, and pennants swirling up into the air. The large drake then dropped down into the centre aisle. This sent the audience screaming and running for their lives. The king clawed his way out of his wrecked tower. "My word, that is one fierce beast," he said. "What do you think, boys?" "Whoa," they replied in unison. "Devil, prepare for your imminent extermination," George yelled as he charged up the aisle toward Graham. "Little knight, I will eat you alive and use your enchanted weapon as my toothpick. Then I will dine upon this sweet maiden for dessert." At this, Graham lunged over George, landing square in the centre of the battlefield. He ramped about, thrashing his wings madly. The smoke billowed and rolled about in a very dramatic fashion. It wisped and whirled around Kenny's mum as she continued playing away on the piano. "We have to flee or he'll pick us off one by one," Kenny heard someone yell. "There's nowhere to run. We're fish in a barrel," another responded. Frozen in his front row seat, old Pop's possum fainted right on the spot. The young lad next to him waved his wooden sword and squealed, "Go, dragon!" "Back off, you foul beast," Charlotte yelled, still bound to the tree. The feisty gal kicked at the dragon while George approached the arena slowly, pitchfork in hand, like a lance. The knight's eyes remained fixed on Graham. No matter where the dragon moved, George announced, "It's no use. This is your final hour." "We'll see about that," replied Graham. He lashed his tail about and whipped the pitchfork right out of George's hand. It flew up in the air, plunging into the trunk of one of the oaks bordering the cave. Graham bellowed out a malicious laugh as he glimpsed the pitchfork lodged in the tree. With Graham's attention diverted for the moment, George ran behind him and leaped upon his scaly back. He drew his sword and yelled, "Devil, your end is nigh!" At that the dragon bucked like a wild horse high into the air. Losing his grip, George dropped his sword and it plunged into the top of the piano, creating a loud, dismal, flat note. Kenny saw his mum pause for a moment and then continue playing more frenetically than ever. The knight held on for dear life as the beast vaulted about the battlefield in an effort to shake him off. The audience members shrieked and hollered as they ran to and fro around the skirmish. However, some were so mesmerised by the action playing out in front of them that they edged in closer to better view the gritty battle, oblivious of the danger. At last, Graham landed atop his cave, just over the entrance. Flexing his back muscles like a cat, he sent a ripple down his spine, loosening George's grasp. The dragon took full advantage of this opportunity and bucked again, this time sending the knight flying off his back. George was sent arcing over the battlefield, crashing into another tree. Branches snapped and crackled and cracked under the weight of the armour as the beaten warrior was swallowed up by the thick foliage. Once more Graham laughed in a low, cold snicker. "You are finished, toy soldier. Now watch, all of you," he turned toward the audience, "as I dine upon your delectable fair damsel." Most everyone in the crowd was silent, save for a few weak sobs. Kenny was wringing his hands and holding his breath. "It's almost over," he whispered to himself. "Come on, George." Charlotte began screaming at the top of her lungs as the cackling dragon turned toward her. His back was now to the knight. George seized his moment and dropped down from the tree, pitchfork in hand, and pinned the drake's tail firmly to the ground. Kenny let out his breath. "Back for more, are you? Enjoy your funeral pyre," Graham thundered. He inhaled deeply and exhaled in an effort to engulf the knight in a fiery ball of flames, but all that came out was a puff of smoke. He inhaled once again, but this time he gasped and coughed out only a smoke ring. The crowd watched, completely stunned. There was George, holding the knotted tail in both hands. He untied Charlotte, pulled his sword from the piano and announced, "The dragon has been defeated." The audience cheered and applauded in a deafening roar. The knight looked over at Kenny, and the boy smiled. But the cheering of the crowd turned into loud ranting as they clamoured, "Off with his head! Off with his head!" Kenny looked at George for some kind of sign, but the knight had positioned himself next to Graham's head with his sword blade on the drake's blue scaly neck. He gazed out toward the king. The crowd fell silent and turned in unison to look for the final command from their ruler. The king stood up in front of the rubble that was once his tower and eyed the dragon as he thoughtfully stroked his beard. Kenny watched one of his sons whisper something into the ruler's ear. The king turned to his boy and said, "What? I don't think so." At this, the audience began murmuring amongst themselves. Kenny noticed that the second son was now whispering into his father's ear. The king turned to both of his sons and said, all right, if that is what you want." Both sons smiled and nodded vigorously. At last, His Majesty cleared his throat and announced in a deep, authoritative voice, "Gallant knight, has this scourge, this devil, been thwarted?" George pulled the sword away and replied, "That he has, your Majesty." The king continued, "Is he no longer a menace to this farm, village, or any surrounding province?" George sheathed his sword and answered, "I believe he is no longer a threat to anyone present." "Indeed," said Graham, as he stepped forward, then bowed to the crowd, "for I have learned the error of my vicious ways." "Then I declare this battle over," the king announced. "Sir George is victorious." The crowd burst into uproarious applause. Kenny was relieved. They had fooled the entire town and neither of his friends had been hurt in the process. But then someone else stepped out onto the battlefield. For you see, when Graham stood up to take his bow, his tail slid out of the pitchfork, and that did not go unnoticed. Oops. Porky's father stormed up, waving his arms madly. "Whoa! Hold on a minute," he yelled. He picked up the pitchfork and held it over his head. The audience oohed. "This whole thing is a joke. It was rigged from the start. The old coot was never going to kill that dragon," he said, pointing at George. He rubbed the tines of the fork. This ain't no magical pitchfork. It's just painted gold." Kenny's heart was beating so hard all he could hear was ba-bump, ba-bump, ba-bump. Scanning the stage, he saw that his mum, Charlotte, and scowling George were watching Porky's father. Finally, his gaze met with Graham's lemony, glowing eyes. For the first time since they'd met on this hill all those nights ago, he saw genuine fear in them. "Now, I say we take responsibility for our own and finish this once and for all," Porky's father shouted, pointing the pitchfork at Graham's chest. "Who's with me?" Chapter 13. Performance of a Lifetime. Kenny's eyes went big. The river stones, the fiery feeling, the river itself, was ready to explode out of him. How could he let the villagers kill Graham after all of this? He had no more chess moves, no more strategies, no more books to help him. "No!" he yelped. "Don't kill him!" He bolted towards Graham and placed himself between the pitchfork and the dragon. "He's my best friend in the world. He never hurt any one of you." Porky's father did not falter. "Get out of my way, kid. This devil has to be dealt with. That's a fact." "Actually," Kenny's mother said, "the fact is the boy's right, and you're going to have to go through both of us in order to get to him." She stood behind her son, between the pitchfork and the dragon. "And me too," the wizard said, removing his hat and revealing the familiar face of Kenny's father. He took his place behind Kenny, next to his wife, and placed both hands on his son's shoulders. The audience was dead silent. Porky's father wavered a bit, but held his ground. Next, George and Charlotte took their place behind Kenny's parents. Now they were all standing between the weapon and Graham. "Of course they're all standing here," Porky's father shouted to the crowd. "This is part of their little show, but this monster has to die before he kills one of us." Then Porky himself walked up and stood next to Kenny. He said to his ruffian father, "It was a really cool battle. Do we have to kill him, Pa?" Porky's father blinked and stepped back. Silence. Not even the crickets were chirping. All Kenny could hear in his head was his own breathing, which panted in time with the sound of the dragon's immense heart, beating rapidly. "Oh gosh," Kenny thought, "Graham's nervous, and when he's nervous, hip!" The fireball puffed out of the dragon's mouth and engulfed Porky's dad. The dumbfounded lout stood there blinking, trying to comprehend what had just happened. All the hair had been singed off his body, and the tips of his ears were smoking. From the back of the audience there came a hearty, loud laugh, and a single clapping, "Encore! Encore!" Everyone turned and looked. Walking down the centre aisle was His Royal Majesty the King. He was clapping excitedly and laughing aloud with his two sons, the jester joining in, whistling and cheering and shouting, "Encore! Encore!" Kenny watched as the shouting spread throughout the entire crowd. Soon the hilltop was clamouring, "Encore! Encore! Encore!" The throngs of townsfolk surged forward onto the stage. They cheered and lifted George, Charlotte, Kenny's parents, and Kenny himself up onto their shoulders. They carried them all around the amphitheatre, hurrahing and hailing the troupe. Kenny looked over at Graham, his best friend in the world, and smiled. The dragon responded in kind with his familiar toothy grin, then loaded a group of kids onto his back and pranced about the amphitheatre with the rest of the party. The sun finally settled down below the hills, causing the clouds in the sky to fade to a deep red before cooling off into a lovely shade of lavender. All along the horizon the little lamplights of Roundbrook flickered on, but no one noticed. They were up on Shepherd's Hill celebrating the performance of a lifetime. Chapter 14. A favourable outcome. "Pecking order," Kenny's father said the next morning as he walked up to his son and handed him the pitchfork. When the true leader is revealed, then there's a new order. It was the dawn after the big battle. The celebration had gone on late into the night, with Kenny and his friends reenacting bits and pieces of their performance for eager groups. Now they were all back on the hill cleaning up the aftermath of the enormous party. Of course, Porky's dad was nowhere to be found, but Porky was there. He turned out to be just as excited to see a real live dragon as Kenny had been, commenting that Graham seemed much hairier and scruffier than he'd imagined. In fact, several of Kenny's classmates, along with Charlotte, had arrived to help tidy up the hilltop. "Last night was a blast," Charlotte said, dropping the hilt from a broken toy sword into a garbage can. Fluttering her eyes and putting the back of her paw on her forehead, she continued, "I've always wanted to be a damsel in distress." The little buck smiled. "Ho, Bantling," Graham said, sweeping his cave entrance. "It looks like George is back, and with a few friends." He pointed to the road, and there was the king's royal procession heading their way. Kenny's mother and father joined their son as the coach reached the summit of the hill. The young knights flanked the carriage as the driver hopped down and opened the door. Out came the jester, the royal sons, George, and finally the king himself. "Kenneth Rabbit," the king said as he approached the lad, "I had to stop by and speak with you before we head back home." Kenny gulped, glancing over at George. "You don't have to do anything to Graham, do you?" he asked. "Oh, heavens, no," the king said with a smile. "I want you, all of you," he gestured to the group, "to come to my palace and give your performance for the royal court." "Heavens, no." Oh, no. Kenny's mother gasped. His father whistled. "Wow, cool," Charlotte said. Kenny blinked. He looked over at George. The old knight was beaming. "My boys and I haven't had a good time like that in ages," the king added, "and George tells me this was all you're doing. So what do you say, lad?" Kenny turned and looked up at the dragon. "Sounds good to me. Graham, what do you think?" Graham looked down at everyone, smiled his toothy grin, and said, "You know, those royal cooks can make desserts you didn't even know existed. Have you ever tasted Austrian lattice pie? Ooh, yummy." And so that is how our story closes. Kenny and company did indeed travel to the king's castle, where they performed for a week to standing room only crowds. That is where I, the royal historian, was finally able to meet the young rabbit and his best friend, who had entertained an entire kingdom. They revelled with the court, visited the royal library, and tasted a variety of delicious foods, including Austrian lattice pie. Kenny's mum even made crème brûlée for the king. It was an experience Kenny would never forget. When the troop finally returned home to their little farming town of Roundbrook, they were welcomed back with a roaring, huge homecoming parade. The townsfolk greeted each and every one of them with congratulations and admiration, because by this time the legend of their act had spread all across the land. After that summer, things settled back down. Kenny continued to live with his parents, started back at school, did his chores on the farm, and even helped out at George's bookshop with Charlotte. For you see, the knight had been commissioned by His Majesty to travel about the countryside revising the King's royal bestiary, and Kenny was determined to help ensure that the research in this new edition was thorough and that the subjects were handled accurately. The celebrated Rabbit of Roundbrook spent the rest of his time with his friends, flying kites, painting sunsets, and acting out plays in the amphitheatre that he and Graham had built on the hilltop. One Sunday, on a cool autumn afternoon, the boy was riding his bicycle up to the summit of Shepherd's Hill. As he hopped off and leaned his bike against a willow tree, he spied his friend curled up in a ball, dozing at the entrance of his cave. "Hey, Graham," he called out so as not to startle the dragon. The great beast opened one large luminous eye, stretched and let out a terrific yawn. Smacking his lips, he said, "Bantling, I was just catching 40 winks in this warm sunny spot I found on the rocks here. What's going on?" "Mum's serving dinner early tonight," Kenny said, pulling something out of his satchel. "George and Charlotte are already there, so I thought I'd come to get you. I wanted to show you this too. It's a new book I borrowed." The dragon sat right up, rubbing his scaly paws together. Ooh, hand it over. I can't wait to see what it is. More prehistoric animals? Creatures from the Ice Age? Renaissance poetry, perhaps? Kenny handed the slim volume to him. Nah, some fairy tale by a British guy. George said we'd really like it. Take a look. The Reluctant Dragon, Graham read as he sent his glasses onto the bridge of his nose. I like the title already. Oh, look, nice pictures. Come on, Kenny said, heading back toward his bike. Let's go get dinner and we'll start reading it tonight. The dragon tucked the book and glasses into his cave and followed the boy to the tree where his bike was parked. Sounds like a grand plan to me. What's your mum got on the menu tonight? Souffle, glazed carrots, and I think she's making a king's Austrian lattice pie for dessert. What are we waiting for then? The dragon squealed. He unfolded his expansive wings and began flapping them excitedly. Race you home! As they took off down the hill, the rabbit and the dragon, their laughter could be heard dancing and swirling about on the wind.